Michael Steele had brought over a consignment of cannabis in a boat from Holland, landing on the Essex coast. But the cannabis was said to have been of a very bad quality, and there were soon complaints from customers and dealers who demanded their money back. Patrick Tate, in particular, was seething with anger about the problems with the cannabis.
In January 1998, Michael Steele and Jack Williams were convicted of the murders of Patrick Tate, Tony Tucker and Craig Rolfe, who were all found murdered in a Range Rover in Retton, Essex in December 1995. This set of videos summarised the background to the case and the evidence and arguments put forward by the prosecution and defence at trial. For the most part, it has been taken from the CCRC's previous statement of reasons on the referral of Jack Williams' conviction to the Court of Appeal. Jack Williams and Michael Steele faced trial co-defendant Peter Corey on an indictment of 5 counts. Count 1, to which all 3 men were alleged to have conspired to import cannabis. Counts 2, 3 and 4 related to the murders of the 3 men, Pat Tate, Tony Tucker and Craig Rolfe. Williams and Steele were charged with the murders, but Corey was not. Count 5 related to the possession of a shotgun. Mr. Steele was the only defendant to this charge. The Crown's case in relation to all the counts relied very heavily on the evidence of Darren Nichols. He was an accomplice to the importation of drugs and was involved in the events surrounding the murders. By consent, the jury was directed to take account of his criminal character and his admitted involvement in the importation of controlled drugs. The jury were directed that in giving evidence for the Crown, Mr. Nichols well may have had an interest of his own to serve in seeking to obtain some lesser sentence than would otherwise be the case. He had lied in his third interview with the police. Mr. Nichols had previously pleaded guilty to and was awaiting sentence upon 4 counts of indictment relating to the importation of drugs, the sale of a firearm and the possession of drugs. Mr. Nichols said that in 1992 he had been imprisoned for counterfeiting offences. Whilst in prison, he befriended the defendants, Mr. Steele and Mr. Williams. In 1993, Patrick Tate moved to the same prison. Mr. Nichols and Mr. Steele already knew him. Mr. Nichols said that he had subsequently contacted Mr. Steele and Mr. Tate when they'd all been released from prison. In 1994, after they had been released, Mr. Nichols had come to dislike Mr. Tate and they had no longer been on speaking terms. Mr. Nichols carried out some electrical work at a house in Clacton that belonged to Mr. Steele's mother. Around this time, Mr. Nichols said that he began to sell cannabis resin for Mr. Steele. He also did some work for Mr. Steele in Brightlingsea, where he, Steele, had a rigid inflatable boat. Mr. Nichols thought that Mr. Steele also disliked Mr. Tate. Nichols gave evidence in relation to several trips abroad that he made with Steele, Williams, Corey and others. The first trip was on the 15th of August 1995. He collected Steele and Corey and they went together in a car via the ferry at Felixstowe to Amsterdam. There they met a man named Stone who agreed to sell them a quantity of drugs. They left the money with Stone and returned to the UK. Nichols and Corey returned to Amsterdam a few days later to collect the drugs. They went by car via the ferry to Ostend in Belgium. When they left Amsterdam, they telephoned Steele in the UK. They arranged to meet Steele on the coast near Blankenberg. Steele travelled from the UK in his rib. When Steele arrived, Nichols and Corey carried the drugs down the beach and loaded them onto the boat. Steele and Corey returned to the UK in the boat. Nichols telephoned Williams to tell him that the boat was on its way back before returning to the UK by car via Calais. He was subsequently paid in drugs by Steele for his part in this importation. Nichols said that on the 3rd of October 1995, he and another man, Francis Reed, went to Amsterdam, crossing the channel by ferry from Felixstowe to Zeebrugge. Nichols said that Mr. Reed did not know at the outset that the purpose of the trip was to purchase and smuggle drugs. Nichols bought cannabis from Stone. He then met Steele on the coast near Blankenberg. The boat was again loaded with the drugs. Nichols said that he was then told by Steele that he would be returning with him, Steele, on the boat. Reed returned to the UK by ferry. Nichols said that crossing in the boat was difficult, the sea was rough, and the fuel tank on the boat split. They landed at Point Clear in Essex, where they met Worms. Mr. Nichols was again paid in drugs for his part in this importation. On the 7th of November 1995, Nichols again went to Holland with Corey. This importation involved the purchase of drugs to the value of £125,000. The money came from various sources, including Pat Tate. Nichols said that he'd collected Corey from Steele's house, where the cash for the purchase was being counted. They travelled from Harwich to Amsterdam as foot passengers and later hired a car. They handed the money to Mr. Stone, then met him to collect the drugs. They drove to the same beach near Blankenberg. Steele picked up the drugs in the boat. Corey returned to the UK with Steele in the boat. The following day, Nichols returned to the UK through Harwich. Nichols said that he'd subsequently learnt from Steele that he, Steele, Worms and Mr. Corey had been arrested by the police and customs officers when Steele had landed at Point Clear. The boat had been searched, but nothing had been found. The drugs had already been offloaded. The three men had been questioned and released. Steele took Nichols to where the drugs had been stored and gave him several kilos to sell. Nichols passed the drugs on to the dealers, but they were returned to him, saying that the cannabis was of very poor quality and was unsellable. Steele said that he had heard the same thing from other people to whom he had supplied the drugs. Steele contacted Mr. Stone, who apologised and said that they had been given the wrong batch, although a third of the drugs was of good quality. He agreed to refund the money if the drugs were returned. On the 15th of November 1995, Nichols went with Steele to Amsterdam to collect the money. Stone initially gave them £30,000 and they agreed to wait whilst he obtained the rest of the refund. They stayed overnight in the Delta Hotel. On the 17th of November, Stone provided them with a further 80,000 guilders, which Mr. Steele accepted. Steele was concerned about carrying large amounts of currency back to the UK and made telephone calls to persuade Tate, Worms and others to travel to Ostend. Steele met Tate and two women and gave them some of the money. Worms came over in a van and took the guilders back to the UK. Steele and Nichols returned to the UK. Steele told Mr. Nichols to dispose of the cannabis, and he did so by throwing it in the sandpits at Braintree. The Crown adduced evidence to corroborate the account given by Nichols regarding the trips to Holland. There was evidence to show that a call had been made from a bar near the beach in Blankenberg to Worms's mobile telephone, as Nichols had claimed. The ferry tickets in relation to the trip were paid for on Nichols's credit card with Reed and booked in Reed's name. There was an entry in an Amsterdam hotel register showing that Nichols had stayed there on the night of the 7th of November and again from the 15th to the 17th of November. There was a booking in Steele's name for a hotel in Ostend. The sandpits at Braintree were searched and blocks of cannabis resin were found. Barry Dorman, a business associate of Pat Tate, gave evidence that he had gone to Ostend with him to collect money. Craig Rolfe and several girlfriends had also gone with them. Evidence was given as to the arrest of Steele, Worms and Corey on the 9th of the 7th and 8th of November. In the early hours of the morning, police officers saw a Range Rover with a trailer and a rib attached. Worms spoke to the officers and said that he'd been diving. Corey and Steele appeared and began to do some work on the boat. Officers of HM Customs and Excise arrived and arrested Steele and Worms and Mr. Corey on suspicion of importing drugs. The boat was searched, but nothing of significance was found. It was taken away for examination, and a very small piece of cannabis resin, weighing about 1/4 gram, was found. The three men were interviewed. Steele and Worms refused to answer any questions. Corey said that he had been out with Steele to help him test the boat and its onboard computer. The boat, he said, had broken down on a number of occasions. The three men were released without charge.